Greetings. Welcome to Remember the Alamo or Forget It. Now, when you hear the words Remember the Alamo, you probably have an image in your head of a small group of patriots, freedom fighters, standing up and sacrificing their lives to delay the advance of a huge force of Mexican soldiers led by a tyrant come to take away your freedom. That's the traditional idea. And if you went to the Alamo, you might do what some folks did that I now have hanging on my wall. They bought a map, which it looks pretty accurate. It's got a lot of the places and times that would have been there during the time that the Alamo was fought. It probably cost them about $10 at the time, but they were so enamored by it that they bought this nice frame and had it framed. Probably paid $50 to get a $10 map framed. Those who have become revisionists of the history of the Alamo would say that's a great example of what the traditional view actually is. It's false, it's fake. It looks like it's old, it looks like it's good. You've made it into a great thing, put it in this nice frame, but it's all a lie. These men were not defending freedom, they were defending slavery. That was their issue. And they were arrogant. They thought they could kill hundreds of Mexicans. They were inept. They didn't know how to fight a battle, and all was one huge accident from which they couldn't escape. They weren't brave. They were trapped. And because of all that, the Alamo itself had no real significance. So let's explore these ideas. First, let's look at the heroes. Those heroes are represented largely by the three men whose names are associated with the Alamo. First of all, James Bowie. Now, James was a land speculator before he came to Texas, and he remained a land speculator after he got to Texas. At one point, he had fraudulently obtained title to hundreds of thousands of square miles of Louisiana and Arkansas, and had sold some of those lands without actual title. When he came to Texas, he was not only running from debts accumulated from those activities, he was also running from the law. A prosecution of his activities was taking place in Washington. In fact, his speculation was so widespread that the word Bowie claims was used generically in Washington for any land fraud that occurred. He also had dabbled a little in slavery, but his issue with the Mexican government was not slaves. It was that they were nullifying his land grants, more land that he had received there to speculate in and to sell. The second person was William Barrett Travis, a young lawyer who tried to make his way in a small town in Alabama, running a small newspaper and practicing law, but had been largely unsuccessful, had run up a pile of debts, and ended up running to Texas to get away from his debts, as many men did, abandoning his wife Rosanna, their son, and a yet unborn child. He had been successful in Texas in establishing a legal practice, but had gotten crossways with the Mexican government, largely because, like a lot of newcomers from America, he thought he was still in the United States and that United States constitutional law should apply to Mexico. He became tangentially involved in slavery because he was involved in some cases where owners were trying to recapture some runaway slaves, which the Mexican government wouldn't return because their laws prohibited slavery. Then there's Davy Crockett, the first American celebrity. So because of the many books and plays that had mythologized his life, that had made him into a character larger than life. Davy had become a congressman, partially based on that mythology, and had, because of his simple honesty, not recognized the dynamics of the rising political party system, and had gotten crossways with his former hero, President Andrew Jackson. Although people had touted him for the presidency, Jackson's efforts to unseat him as a congressman were successful, and so he had come to Texas partially and maybe primarily to rebuild his political career in a new country that he thought might be forming. He also was a person who thought, well, maybe by fighting I'll get some notoriety so I win office a little bit more quickly, and maybe even get a land bounty so I have a little bit of wealth and don't run up a bunch of debts in Texas. So those were the kind of sort of leaders of this group of people, maybe about 140, 150, when the battle was starting to begin. They were representative of those men. Most of them were newcomers detectives. They came for the adventure of the fighting, maybe some land bounties, new opportunities, and most were running from the law and from debt. So the battle itself, how'd that happen? Well, Bowie showed up because Sam Houston had ordered him there to retrieve whatever cannon he could and destroy the Alamo and maybe San Antonio too. But when he got there, things got confused. First, from a practical angle, he had no horses to carry the cannon away. Then he got word that the council, the government of Texas at that time, had countermanded Houston's order. He was actually supposed to stay and defend the Alamo, which he thought was not a bad idea because just a few months prior, the Mexicans had thought it was pretty important, had defended it with about 600, 700 troops, but had to surrender because they ran out of provisions. So he thought maybe this is worth fighting for. That got bolstered a little bit when Travis shows up with 30 men, leader of the new Texas Cavalry, which only had 30 men in it, but kind of promised provisions, maybe more men. They were constantly getting information that that kind of thing was going to happen, and so they stayed. Then Crockett shows up. He's wandered around looking for where the fight is. He hears the fight is coming along where the Alamo is because there are thousands of Mexican troops who are massing below the border near where the Alamo is. They would cross the Alamo and maybe he'd see a little action, but just a little. He wasn't looking to get into a real battle. He's just like kind of trying to make this false mystique name for himself that he had in the United States. So, many-sided men. The battle itself was partially intentional and partially accidental. Bowie decided that the place was worth defending and stayed. Travis showed up with men ostensibly to defend the Alamo. Everybody in there, from anything they knew, thought the Texas government wanted them to stay and fight the Mexicans when they arrived. And they stayed partially through the provisions and men that they were continuously promised. And during the days before the battle, another 30 men showed up from Gonzales. So they had these little ideas that others were coming to greet them. In fact, there was a thought that the men down here in Goliad, La Bahia, James Fannin and his 500 men could make the journey up to the Alamo, about 80 miles, and really bring them up to the strength they needed to defend it. So they had a certain amount of confidence. Were they arrogant in thinking that they could kill more Mexicans than the Mexicans could kill them? Yes, but that was probably legitimate. They had Kentucky rifles that shot 200 yards. The Mexicans had poor old brown Besses from the English that maybe could make 100 yards on a good day. But they knew something else. They needed those extra men because the Alamo's not like you see it today. What's there now is the old church, the long barracks, and a few other buildings. But the Alamo that they were defending was a quarter mile or more around. They needed at least 600 or 700 men to have any hope of defending it against a force that was probably, they thought at least 1,500, maybe 2,000. The actual force of 4,000 or 5,000 men across the border with Santa Anna were mainly from the peon class. Santa Anna wasn't this golden fighter for the freedom of slaves. He came from a class society that had been inherited in Mexico from the Spanish. While there was no technical ownership of one human being by another, the peon classes might as well have been slaves. And most of his soldiers were slaves. They really didn't have much choice but to come and do what they were told. So he's not the hero he's made out to be by the revisionists either. It is true that by the time on February 23rd that the Mexican cavalry showed up, 1,500 strong, that there was very little chance that any of the men in the Alamo could escape. Yet, not totally true, because during the 12 days before the attack actually occurred, the battle itself, men came and went pretty freely, taking messages, getting food, bringing provisions. They probably couldn't all have left at once. But if they wanted to go, they could have. In groups of maybe 2, 3, they could have abandoned the post. And some of them actually did. So it's not true that they were totally trapped inside. They stayed because they thought supplies and troops were coming. Now, the battle itself, once it commenced on March 6th, was really over before it started because no reinforcement came. There were maybe 180 fighting men available at the time of the attack. The attack force, from what we can tell, was at least 1,600 of Santa Anna's men. And while the troops inside, Texan troops, did kill and wound about 600 of those, Santa Anna had all kinds of reserves. She just kept calling up men, and the result was inevitable. They stormed the walls. They killed all the militia that were inside. They only allowed the women, children, and a couple of slaves and Tejanos to survive, basically to go tell the Texans what had happened there. And they allowed them to witness the fact that they killed everybody, piled their bodies up, and basically burned them on funeral pyres. So the battle was, to some extent, not due to ineptitude, but due to orders, but its result was inevitable. Now, the significance of the battle. Was there really a delay? Yes, but it wasn't really caused by the troops. They didn't have much chance. Santa Anna, if he wanted to, could have gone right around them with thousands of troops and not worried about them coming up on his rear at all. They were no threat. He stopped there to retaliate for the victory the Texans had had some months earlier at the same place. And he savored it. He hung around for 12 days before the assault. With those 12 days and the 4 or 5 it took to clean things up after the battle, bury his own dead, other things, he actually delayed himself for almost 2 weeks. Very valuable time for Sam Houston to gather more troops and muster a real army. Did they inflict huge losses? No, but enough to make a problem. The other thing that was happening was when word of the battle reached Houston, he actually did something that Santa Anna didn't anticipate. He used it as a rallying cry to get troops, so that by the time he met Santa Anna in battle, he had 800 men. And that's important because Santa Anna was so arrogant at the time that he had destroyed the Alamo, destroyed the troops, that he divided his forces. He'd sent them in different directions to decimate different Texan forces and took only 1,000 men with him. So that when Houston actually met him on the battlefield, the odds were almost even. To say that it wasn't significant is carrying things a bit too far. And the interesting thing is, this battle over views of the Alamo, it's still going on. There are, at this very moment, if you arrive on the right day, people in cameo gear and carrying AR-15 assault rifles to defend the Alamo, this time against other versions, other meanings of what the Alamo should be. And because they're doing that, the Battle of the Alamo, the battle of these different philosophies and ideas of what was going to happen, it just keeps going. And we'll explore that further next time.